Okay, so I wanted to talk specifically about migration of Indigenous Australians because there is some discussion about whether or not they were nomadic or whether they were farmers and how they actually got here and things like that. So this is just a quick video about Indigenous peoples. So in the last video, it showed about how we moved from out of Africa and around the world. So this is a detailed map of the evidence that's been seen around Australia in relation to how Indigenous people moved around Australia. And so you can see here that we came in from the top and then we moved around Australia in pretty quick time. So you can see here, this is KY stands for years ago. So this is 46 to 45,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. But you can see how quickly, I mean, admittedly there's a few thousand years in it, but the Indigenous people quickly moved throughout Australia and it's understood around the coastline. So these numbers here actually relate to the genetic markers that we use to do the mapping of this knowledge. So I can't go into the detail of that because I'm not familiar with it, but it does show the evidence of how the Indigenous people did move very quickly in their settlement of Australia once they came to the continent itself. So then let's have a conversation about nomadic versus farming. So nomadic means that you moved from place to place fairly quickly in order to be able to hunt and gather. So you'd spend a couple of nights in one place and then move on. And so there'd be a constant migration around the landscape while you followed the food. So, you know, you'd follow the kangaroos or you'd follow the various animals so that you can hunt them as you went around. And as you gathered things, you'd clear out that little bit of area, so then you'd move on to the next area. So it was originally thought that the Indigenous peoples of Australia were quite nomadic, so basically subsistence living, moving from place to place fairly regularly. So that means lots of movement, lots of migration around the countryside. However, this book, Dark Emu, by Bruce Pascoe, puts a lot of other evidence on the table that shows that Indigenous people were actually farming people. So, for example, backburning, so you burn an area so that fresh grass would grow, that would attract kangaroos to that area, so then it makes it more easier to kill them. So you can actually have quite substantial villages or living areas, if you like, in relation to that. There's also a large degree of evidence showing that large fishing or aquaculture type mechanisms were set up. So channels were dug so that fish and eels would go down certain areas so that would make them easier to catch and things like that. And again, that allowed Indigenous people to become slightly more permanent in their settlements. So there's a bit of different evidence that's coming out in relation to whether or not our Indigenous peoples did migrate regularly around the country once they arrived, or whether they were closer to sort of more early agricultural type living. So, and then this is interesting, and if you're interested in this area, you might want to have a read of that book. But of course, they did actually move together, you know, tribes would come together for gatherings. So there was migration around the countryside in relation to coming together for certain events. So this is things like corroborees, where there was a celebration of the dream time or various other rites and rituals that were celebrated by various different groups of Indigenous people. Your rites of passage, so coming of age rites, you know, various bits and pieces which were celebrated. Smoking ceremonies, which was linked to farewelling or, you know, the spirits of the dead and the cleansing of various places. And to do all this, song lines were used. Now, you probably learned about song lines in Year 7, and it's about how Indigenous people use song to be able to navigate around the countryside. So the song would be in line with the geography of the area, and as you sang the song, you'd be able to walk from place to place to sing your way basically through the countryside to make sure you knew where you were going. And these song lines were actually used to move from one place to another, and they were held by various groups of Indigenous people, so you'd pass from one group to another, and they're fairly well known. So we did have, so once the Indigenous people did arrive in Australia, there was migration around the countryside to get together for various bits and pieces, to meet and celebrate things. However, it's highly likely that they weren't as nomadic as we thought, and that there was actually substantial farming techniques being used and semi-permanent settlements.